Have you ever wondered how your favorite monster from Monster Hunter was designed? What its creators thought and felt as they sketched and programmed these fierce and iconic creatures? Well, while I have not unlocked the ability to read minds yet, I do own copies of Monster Hunter Principles of Creativity 1 and 2, which are special interview collections released for the series' 10th and 15th anniversaries. In it, the dev teams talk at length about how certain monsters were created, and like nearly all Monster Hunter books, these never left Japan. I have recently started translating these interviews in my free time, with the eventual goal of presenting them to you in voiced video form, which is what we're doing today. So, to celebrate the release of Monster Hunter Wilds Title Update 2, we will be going over the interview focusing on the development and creation of Lagiacrus. This interview took place in 2014 and was published in Principles of Creativity 1. In it, Kaname Fujioka and Yuya Tokuda discuss how they designed Lagiacrus while also touching on the creation of underwater combat more broadly. If you'd prefer reading this interview instead of listening to it, I have also posted it on Reddit, link in the description. But for those that are still here, sit back and enjoy the story of how Lagiacrus was created. Monster Hunter Tri really was quite different compared to previous entries, wasn't it? The inclusion of underwater environments and combat alone make it stand out. Yeah, and it was quite exciting to work on. I remember just singing "underwater, underwater" repeatedly after being asked to work on it. I remember asking the team, what would you think of making a Monster Hunter game set entirely under the sea? And there were quite a few reactions like that. Would you say that underwater gameplay was something you had wanted to do since the beginning? No, definitely not from the very start of the series at least. Our maps commonly included bodies of water, and I would occasionally hear playtesters and developers say, I wish I could go explore down there. After all, water is beautiful and an integral part of any Earth-like ecology. After thinking about it, I realized that while some monsters were able to enter the water and move through it, players were entirely unable to follow them into it. So the desire to be able to move through water was actually a very natural consequence of the games we had designed already. So in that sense, you could say that the seeds for underwater combat were planted very early, even if by accident. When it came time to develop Monster Hunter Tri, we had already created a fairly established formula of what Monster Hunter is, so I thought it would be interesting to try something radically different. Our approach to land combat had already started to become quite predictable and established, so this new idea felt like a great way to freshen the series up a bit and try something new. Alright, but be honest. How feasible did you think it would be to make Monster Hunter work with a focus on underwater combat? My first impression was that this would be a mess. I remember spending a lot of time just thinking about what underwater Monster Hunter even meant. 360-degree movement is something you associate with zero gravity, or indeed swimming, which were both design elements that were entirely foreign to the series at that time. So how did you start? The first thing we did was to take a player and a monster model and simply place them into an underwater environment. We had no controls, mechanics, or AI developed at that point. It was purely to get a feel for what a setting like that feels like. I see. So you reduce the question of what is underwater Monster Hunter to its simplest form. So, how did it feel? This was a pretty simple and low-cost exercise, since placing models in a 3D environment is quite easy. But even as we were doing it, I already started thinking about the big question. What kind of experience and value does underwater movement add to the gameplay? The answer we arrived at is that 360-degree movement could allow players to reach places, objects, and monster parts that were usually out of reach. So in the next step of this exercise, we added some basic controls to the player and just experimented, moving up and down, closer to the monster and then backing off, approaching it from different angles. Once I was actually seeing a version of it in action, underwater combat felt really fresh and exciting. Do you remember what your final conclusion was from this exercise? I was really struck by the ability to view and approach the monster from all sides, seeing the back and belly in ways that were previously impossible. I remember thinking, if we can pull this off, this will be amazing. Indeed, but first you'd have to overcome various challenges. Oh yes, we struggled especially at the start of production. Before we could even design any monsters, we had to first establish the movement of the player. The sudden switch to an underwater playstyle was as disorienting for us as it would be for players if not managed carefully. So a large hurdle was to create a movement system that allowed players to feel in control while communicating the qualities of water. We tried out many different versions in the end. And how did you approach the monsters once you got to them? The question we kept returning to was, what can you only do underwater? As we figured out what actions were possible while submerged and which ones weren't, we realized that an entire game underwater would probably not work. But this worked in our favor. If the game was going to be a hybrid experience between land and water gameplay, then that switch between the two planes would naturally change what areas could be reached, how a monster could be fought, what items could be gathered, etc. It naturally created a completely unique experience. This kickstarted many subsequent creative ideas that made it into the final game, such as monster weak spots that are only reachable when submerged. While you were experimenting and figuring out how the player would interact with water, was Lagiacrus the first monster you designed around this concept? That's right. If I recall, the key phrase I gave the design team was, "Don't think you can beat this guy on land." I later clarified that it was fine for it to go back and forth between land and water, but the only way to master that fight would be to master underwater combat? Precisely. But the only way we'd encourage players to master fighting underwater was to make underwater gameplay actually fun and engaging, so we focused a lot of time and effort on that. We spent a lot of time experimenting. For Lagiacrus, one of the first adjustments we made was to make it always attempt to match the player's height in space. Many of its attacks see it rising up before evening out, often idling such that the player roughly remains at the height of the monster's chest. In a way, we wanted to match how players would see monsters on land, sitting on roughly the same level. But conversely, this system made it so that the Lagiacrus would continuously adjust to the player's movement, emphasizing its agility underwater. This sense of familiarity associated with facing a monster on an equal level also opened up the possibility to subvert that expectation and surprise players with attacks coming from unusual angles. All of these adjustments were iterated on throughout production. We were also mindful of making Lagiacrus keep a certain distance from the player, as its size and length would make its moves hard to read if it got too close. This, combined with the aforementioned shared height mechanic, resulted in the player basically always being able to see what the monster is doing. Players, in turn, feel more in control and can spend more of their energy mastering the new movement instead of worrying about what the monster might be up to off-screen. And since the player ends up continually facing the Lagiacrus, I decided to design its attacks with correct dodging directions in mind, like how its tail swipes must be dodged sideways, while its body slam demands a downward dive. This created a satisfying and readable back and forth that I felt worked great at emphasizing the appeal of this new dimension of movement. It was around that time, when we were watching testers dodge sideways, downward, upward, all while swimming around this large leviathan, that I really felt that we had created an experience that would not have been possible in previous games. That being said, movement alone wasn't the only hurdle, was it? For example, I imagine that the new underwater sections required new considerations on how to communicate nuanced factors such as depth to the player. That's right. With the addition of height to the axes that the player must now keep track of, the eye's relationship to distance and depth changes. It took a lot of trial and error to get the camera and visual effects right to make this as intuitive as possible. It's not like underwater combat was the only new mechanic in Monster Hunter Tri either. It was a game full of new features, such as monsters having stamina that could be depleted, and we had to make sure all of those also translated well into the underwater sections. One major element that helped us stay on track was the flexibility of Lagiacrus being able to go on land and underwater. This afforded us many opportunities for interesting game design. For one example, fighting it on land is a lot easier, and when it runs out of stamina, the Lagiacrus is forced to exit the water. So if a player was not confident of their skills underwater, they could equip a weapon or armor skill that drains the monster's stamina, and thus bend the flow of the battle in their favor. This hybrid approach really was great. In my case, I used it to sketch out the game's progression based on how mandatory underwater combat is. Ludroth is a fight that takes place 70% on land and 30% underwater, while Gobel is 50-50, and Lagiacrus is 30% land and 70% underwater. My idea was that this game would gradually demand more advanced underwater skill, culminating in the narrative climax against Cedeus, an elder dragon that is fought 100% underwater. How did you decide on Lagiacrus' abilities and moveset? If I recall, the idea of thunderbolts coursing through water was around from very early on in the production, even if we only executed that idea later on. Despite the fact that I hate elemental projectiles. Oh yeah, Fujioka-san has hated elemental projectile attacks for ages. Oh, how come? Because if you include them, every designer immediately overly relies on them. When we were designing the thunder projectile attacks, I remember him saying, "He looks like he's vomiting. Why is our flagship monster throwing up into the ocean? It looks gross." I did also have constructive feedback, like, how do we depict the generation of electricity? But overall, since the elemental abilities of the Lagiacrus was not something we had established right at the start, I didn't feel comfortable with adding them midway through the design process. Could it be that you associate elemental projectiles and breath attacks with flying wyvern rather than leviathans? The thing is, breath and projectile attacks are actually disproportionately easy to punish. In most cases, the monsters stand still while launching these projectiles, which usually fly in predetermined arcs. So a player can quite easily either dodge away comfortably or maneuver around to damage the monster as it performs this attack. But exactly this simplicity was why I felt that projectile attacks would be crucial to making underwater combat work. They are low-risk, high-reward moments that work really well alongside the increased focus on positioning and movement that results from underwater combat. We ended up having a large debate in the office over whether or not Lagiacrus would need elemental attacks and projectiles. Eventually, the group among us that were actually developing Lagiacrus, we called ourselves Team Lagia, decided that the only way to convince Fujioka-san was to have a direct comparison between a Lagiacrus that only uses physical attacks and one that also has access to elemental projectiles. So we just created two Lagiacrus and showed them both off. Another caveat was that they could not add any big body slams or explosions. Attacks with a large area of effect are easy to design, and thus easily become crutches. But yes, in the end, I agreed that the Lagiacrus version that used thunder attacks was a lot better. In this case, I thought that if elemental attacks were necessary to bring out the appeal of underwater combat, then I was willing to compromise. I was just very concerned about adding such flashy attacks and maneuvers, especially since the actual nitty-gritty of how underwater movement would work had not been finalized yet at that point. My usual advice to every design team is don't rely on elemental attacks, find what makes the monster unique first. It did work out for Lagiacrus, but for the most part I still maintain this attitude. It's not just about breath attacks and projectiles. There are many moves like tail swipes, slams, claw slashes, etc. that feel cool and worth adding to most monsters, especially since that allows for a full kit of attacks that cover every possible distance and angle. But if you design monsters like this, they all end up being good at everything and feel repetitive and unremarkable as a result. So Fujioka-san's advice about first honing in on what will make the monster unique and then going from there is a great way to avoid making all monsters feel the same. But in this specific case, I felt that we really needed to add an elemental aspect to Lagiacrus, so I went ahead and pushed for it. It's not like I don't see the appeal of such designs. Rather, focusing on what seems outwardly cool and impactful without first establishing what makes the encounter unique is how you end up with hollow designs that lack their own identity. But granted, this is hard to judge in the early phases anyway, as interactions between monster and player are crucial in identifying this unique essence. Once I was able to watch a playtester dodge around the Lagiacrus, negotiate distance with it by observing its attacks, and weaving around its breath projectiles, that's when the design really clicked for me. And so, this is how we were eventually able to add the thunder element to Lagiacrus' kit. One thing I came to appreciate after this point is that since we had decided that monsters would stay at a certain distance away from the player underwater in order to maximize visibility, long-range projectile attacks actually synergized really well with that, since they naturally pressure players at a distance. I have to ask, what was that second Lagiacrus like? The one that only had physical attacks? In 2 words, hard and lacking. We gave it an honest shot to make the comparison between the 2 versions fair and balanced, but the physical-only iteration felt distinctly unfinished. We ended up seeing this as a sign that Lagiacrus would not feel complete unless we added its now iconic thunder abilities. What I'm hearing here is that this was a design unlike any other you had done before. And so far, you have only talked about designing the underwater portion of the fight. Would you say that creating the land-based portion was equally as difficult? Yes, in its own way. Since Lagiacrus drags its belly on the ground while on land, the surface area that the player can attack is unusually large. So we had to make sure that players couldn't just annihilate it too easily while on land. The land phase of the fight is, of course, meant to be less challenging than the underwater phase, but we still wanted Lagiacrus to put up a fight. Everything about the Lagiacrus and the fight changes as it transitions between land and water. Where the player attacks, how the monster moves, the range of its attacks, the abilities it can wield. In a very real way, it was like designing 2 monsters at once, while still needing the end result to feel cohesive. Due to this, the amount of work poured into this was unprecedented at the time. One thing I remember noticing is that when on land, Lagiacrus will step backwards as it spits thunderballs. Yeah, when the fight occurred on land, we noticed that players would stick to the general area right in front of the Lagiacrus' chest. If the monster released a thunderball from that position, it would simply fly over the players' heads and be harmless. So by having the monster take a small step back, the thunderball becomes a real threat again, and punishes players that are too complacent with their positioning. I see. Underwater, we designed attacks that would track the player and aim straight for them. But on land, Lagiacrus cannot move as easily, and so players end up standing quite close to it. In order to make the fight readable and challenging despite that, we had to design attacks that punished likely positions that the player might use to whittle away at the monster's health. Yeah, while it is quite agile and graceful underwater, a Lagiacrus on land is quite slow and clumsy. Players can literally run circles around it, and because of its long, stiff neck, the monster cannot easily cover its blind spots. Well, if you stay too close, it will bite you all the same though. What we ended up doing was designing the Lagiacrus' land attacks to always move the monster a small bit, allowing it to change positions slightly just by attacking the player. As an aside, I heard that Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate and Monster Hunter 4 were being developed at roughly the same time? That's right. So would you say that working on underwater combat inspired the vertical level design and mounting attacks seen in Monster Hunter 4? Yeah, I think that is fair to say. Seeing how much the gameplay changed by introducing height as a factor, and watching how that decision rippled across the entire feel of the game, made me want to recreate that in a more familiar way. So with Monster Hunter 4, I aimed to design a combat system that inherited some of the verticality of underwater combat while being entirely land-based. Returning to Lagiacrus, how did its position as an underwater encounter influence its visual design? As mentioned previously, depth perception was a major point of concern for us when developing this new movement system. So we decided early on that Lagiacrus would have a long body, so that players could observe the head and the tail and the distance between them to gauge distances a little more intuitively. From that long body shape, I remember proposing that we give it distinct and different poses when on land and underwater that take advantage of that length, being more coiled when it is on land and being more stretched out when it's swimming underwater. I figured that this would also make for some really cool illustrations. The end result resembles a kind of marine dinosaur. Yeah, but since this is a flagship monster, it also needed to look memorable. I was especially adamant about its face, and how it needed some kind of unique feature to be iconic. If I remember correctly, the very first design draft was a long and thin monster with a coiling body like a snake. What about color? I always thought that the red shell of the Rathalos was incredibly striking, so I figured a strong blue would work very well for Lagiacrus. We coincidentally didn't have many normal monsters with predominantly blue color schemes at that time, so this also made Lagiacrus stand out. And, of course, the color was also chosen because we thought it looked cool. After that, it was mostly a matter of adding details and refining the form. How about the ecological explanation of its thunder element? Was that tough to come up with? Tokuda-san actually whipped up the ecology for Lagiacrus without too much trouble. I also lent a hand for some of the biology, so with our forces combined, the ecology was fairly easy to design. Monster Hunter Tri was designed with an ecology-first approach, so we were quite particular on how we depicted the physiology of our monsters and how fatigue and low health affect their bodies. For Lagiacrus, we also felt it was necessary to express such aspects both underwater and on land, to create the impression that this beast truly lives and dies in both realms. Once we had some basic ecological facts sketched out, we simply expanded from there. I remember that we kept having long discussions on various details that had to be just right. As I mentioned before, I was really pedantic about the shape and look of the face. Another interesting feature was the cobra-like hood. Some design drafts had it, while others did not. I remember seeing one design that had the hood and thinking, oh, we need to keep this. Yeah, it was such a striking visual choice. I also made a lot of suggestions based on part breaks that I wanted to see, like, let's add a horn over here. Since players can attack the Lagiacrus from multiple angles, there should also be a reason to do so and a reward for doing so. One thing I suggested was to have the chest be breakable in a way that results in a large, cool scar. Approaching Lagiacrus as it slumbers beneath the seas of the deserted island was a truly majestic first impression. Is that island the monster's natural habitat? Yes, the Lagiacrus lives in the waters around and beneath the deserted island. In the furthest corner of the island, one can even find its nest area. Meanwhile, the subspecies is more common on land. Yes, Lagiacrus is a monster that combines land and sea. Branching off from that, we created a subspecies that is fought mostly on land, and a rare species that is exclusively battled underwater. This specialization felt like a very natural expansion from the base species. Last question. What is the origin of the name Lagiacrus? Lagiacrus is a word that translates to shining vortex or great whirlpool. Oh yeah, I had forgotten about that. I remember agonizing about the name for quite some time, and no suggestion felt quite right. I threw around dozens of potential names, including Lagiatus, Radaya, and Lariatooth. But all of them were kind of uncomfortable to say out loud. Looking back, picking monster names might have actually been the hardest part of developing Monster Hunter Tri. And that was it. Hope you learned something new about our favorite crocodile boy. As I've said before, let me know if you enjoy these interview videos and I'll make more if you do. But for now, take care and have fun with Title Update 2. Of course, I would like to thank all of the wonderful people who support us on Patreon and through YouTube channel memberships. I would like to especially thank Mr. Gayballs, Symphony Savior, Unfortunately Not Zako, British Empire, Just a Hunter, Meta Defiance, Resident Neko Arc, Autumns, Anjanath Tamer's Ambience, Wandering Soul, Stormbreaker Kai, Joshua Ellison, Uthduna is an Octopus, Chocolate Coat, Hunter Espanol, Precum King, Joey Tribby 58, Makamawi, Uriv, CJ, Carl the Crab, Christopher Bronson, Harpier, Suddenly, Molly Mockery, Rose, Zyperius Volkvar, Hamburger Discord, Zaffi, Theopaz, Lufish, Morgleblank, Tacti Wolf, Phyla Zero, Jacob Coleman, Hellbug Hunter, Shebo, M1 Have 12, Regal Eagle, Ronger 97, Quali, Mad Hat 124, My Name Gone, The Dollarfish, Sheba, Ryan Hook, Veraxis, Thick, Kuroneko, Zion H.V. Augensen, Alistair in Wonderland, Jacob Denumnut, Soruka, Sir Newt, Evie, Rambling Robin, Lex Aegis, Hashi, Black Ace 202, Dissy, Habo Himbro Mirror, Magenta, Russell, Vulgar Beast, Person 212, Claire Miboon, Oakwood Tree, Mr. Pyramid, Makot 02, Nils Schlatter, Iron Camel, and Nah, I'm going to bed. Alright folks, take care. I'm going to go take an ice bath because it is unbelievably hot here. Alright, bye, happy hunting.